In 2023, a laboratory in Copenhagen made a discovery that would rewrite 10,000 years of human history. Geneticists were analysing DNA samples from modern Greenlandic Inuit volunteers. Standard ancestry work, nothing unusual, until the results came back. Inca genetic markers. From the Andes Mountains in South America. Aztec markers from central Mexico. Na-Dene markers from the Pacific Northwest of North America, and Norse markers from Scandinavia, all in the same population, all from different time periods spanning 1,000 years, all proving that Greenland wasn't just visited by Vikings, it was a meeting point, a crossroads where migrations from both directions, from the Americas westward and from Europe eastward, converged for 10,000 years. This is the story they didn't want you to know, because it proves that indigenous peoples were navigating vast ocean distances, crossing thousands of miles of open water, establishing trade networks spanning multiple continents, long before Europeans claimed to discover anything. And unlike oral histories that can be dismissed, unlike artifacts that can be reinterpreted, DNA doesn't lie. So let's follow the genetic evidence. Let's see what 10,000 years of Greenland's DNA reveals about human migration, cultural contact, and the indigenous navigation capabilities that colonial powers spent 2 centuries trying to erase. To understand what happened in Greenland, we need to go back, way back, to a time when the last ice age was ending, when glaciers were retreating north, and when humans were following the herds into lands that had been covered in ice for tens of thousands of years. Around 2500 BCE, that's 4,500 years ago, the first people arrived in Greenland. Archaeologists call them the Sakak culture, named after the site in western Greenland where their artifacts were first discovered in 1950. Stone tools, harpoon points, evidence of seal hunting, signs of a people adapted to one of Earth's harshest environments. For decades, everyone assumed the Sakak were the ancestors of modern Inuit. It made sense. They lived in Greenland. Modern Inuit live in Greenland. Simple continuity, right? But in 2010, geneticists extracted DNA from a tuft of hair found at a Sakak archaeological site. Hair that had been frozen in permafrost for 4,000 years. And when they sequenced that ancient DNA and compared it to modern populations, they found something nobody expected. The Sakak weren't related to modern Inuit. They weren't closely related to Native Americans either. They were a completely separate migration wave from Siberia, a ghost population, people who came, lived, adapted, and then largely disappeared, leaving only faint genetic traces in some modern populations. They were genetically distinct, an evolutionary dead end that lasted 2,000 years before vanishing from the archaeological record. Why did the Sakak disappear? We don't know for certain. Climate change is the usual suspect. Temperatures shifting, ice patterns changing, the animals they hunted moving elsewhere. Resource depletion is possible. Disease. Or maybe something else arrived and outcompeted them. Because around 800 BC, the Sakak sites go silent, and a new culture appears in the archaeological record. The Dorset people, also called Paleo-Eskimo by archaeologists, though that term is falling out of favour. The Dorset were different from the Sakak, better adapted to Arctic conditions, more sophisticated hunting technology. They made it work in Greenland for 2,000 years. From 800 BCE to about 1200 CE, the Dorset were Greenland's primary inhabitants. And here's where the DNA gets interesting, because when modern geneticists analysed ancient Dorset remains and compared them to modern Greenlandic Inuit DNA, they found something. Not direct ancestry. The Dorset aren't the main ancestors of modern Inuit, but there are traces, small genetic contributions, evidence of contact, evidence of mixing, evidence that when new people arrived in Greenland, They didn't always just replace the previous inhabitants. Sometimes they merged. Sometimes they had children together. Sometimes the line between us and them got blurry. This pattern, new arrivals mixing with previous inhabitants rather than completely replacing them, this becomes important because it happens again and again in Greenland's history. It's not a story of conquest and replacement. It's a story of contact and merging, of genetic legacies that survive by adapting, by joining with whoever comes next. The Dorset lasted until around 1200 CE. 2,000 years of survival in one of the most challenging environments humans have ever inhabited. But they weren't isolated during all that time, because the DNA reveals something else, something that makes conventional historians very uncomfortable. Now here's where we need to talk about what mainstream history has been teaching for the past 200 years. According to that narrative, the people of the Americas, from the Inca in South America to the Aztec in Mexico to the various indigenous nations of North America, they all stayed put. They didn't cross oceans, they didn't navigate vast distances, they were isolated from the rest of the world until Europeans arrived and discovered them. That's the story. That's what's in the textbooks. But the DNA tells a completely different story. Modern Greenlandic Inuit carry genetic markers that trace back to 3 distinct Mesoamerican and North American populations. The Inca people of the Andes, the Aztec people of central Mexico, and the Na-Dene peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Let me say that again more slowly because it's important. Greenlandic Inuit, people living on an island in the North Atlantic, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, carry DNA from the Andes Mountains in South America, from the highlands of Mexico, and from the Pacific coast of North America. Now, if this were just 1 or 2 individuals, you might explain it away. Recent mixing maybe, a few ancestors from elsewhere. But it's not 1 or 2 individuals. It's a population-wide pattern. And here's the detail that makes it undeniable. Canadian Inuit don't have this genetic signature. Alaskan Inuit have only the Na-Dene markers, and only in specific southwestern Alaska populations. But Greenlandic Inuit have all 3. Inca, Aztec, Na-Dene. What does that mean? It means these populations didn't just migrate from Asia through the Bering Land Bridge, then slowly spread from Alaska to Greenland. That would leave the same genetic pattern in all Inuit populations, but it doesn't. The pattern is unique to Greenland, which means people were coming from the west, from the Americas, directly to Greenland, crossing thousands of miles of ocean to reach this remote Arctic island. And the DNA reveals something else. Layers. The oldest genetic markers are Inca related, dating to somewhere between 800 and 1000 CE, possibly earlier. Then come Aztec markers, roughly 1300 to 1500 CE. Then Na-Dene markers, overlapping with the others but continuing more recently. These weren't all one migration, these were waves. Multiple groups from multiple regions of the Americas, all making their way to Greenland over the course of several centuries. Think about what this means. The Inca, who we're told never had ocean-going vessels capable of long voyages, somehow contributed DNA to people living thousands of miles away in the Arctic. The Aztec, who supposedly never ventured beyond Mesoamerica, left genetic traces in Greenland. The Na-Dene peoples of the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, Alaska, the coastal regions, they somehow ended up with descendants in the far North Atlantic. For decades, anthropologists and historians dismissed Native American oral histories about long-distance ocean voyages. When Spanish chroniclers in the 1500s recorded Inca and Aztec stories about people travelling vast distances by sea, European scholars declared them myths, exaggerations, impossible. The boats weren't sophisticated enough, they said. The navigation techniques weren't advanced enough. Indigenous peoples couldn't possibly have crossed oceans. They just weren't capable of that kind of seafaring. But the DNA proves otherwise. Indigenous peoples were migrating. They were navigating. They were crossing vast ocean distances long before Columbus, long before the Vikings, long before any European set foot in a boat with the intention of exploring. And they weren't just surviving these voyages, they were reaching specific destinations. They were establishing themselves in new lands. They were leaving permanent genetic legacies, but we can still detect today, 1,000 years later. How did they do it? That's a question for another documentary, honestly. We can look at what we know about indigenous boat-building technology. The sophisticated maritime cultures of the Pacific Northwest with their ocean-going canoes, the balsa wood rafts of South American coastal peoples, some of which were capable of carrying tons of cargo, the evidence of extensive trade networks along the Pacific coast of the Americas, the astronomical and navigational knowledge encoded in indigenous calendars and architectural alignments. All of this suggests sophisticated seafaring capabilities that European colonizers chose not to acknowledge. But we don't need to fully explain the how to accept the what. The DNA evidence is clear. Greenlandic Inuit carry genetic markers from South America, from Mesoamerica, from the Pacific Northwest. Those markers got there somehow. And the most straightforward explanation, the one that requires the fewest assumptions, is that people from those regions travelled to Greenland. Not by accident, not as castaways blown off course in storms, but as deliberate voyages across vast distances. Why would they go to Greenland? We can speculate. Climate refugees fleeing changes in their homelands. Explorers seeking new territories and resources. Traders following ivory and fur routes. Exiles fleeing conflicts or seeking freedom. Or maybe just the same reason humans have always migrated. Because we're curious. Because there's something over the horizon, and we want to know what it is. Because we can. The genetic evidence also tells us something about what happened when these different groups met in Greenland. Because the DNA isn't just from one population or the other, it's mixed, blended, which means when Inca descended people met Aztec descended people, met Na-Dene descended people, met the Dorset people already living in Greenland, they didn't just fight or separate into isolated communities. They had children together. They merged their gene pools. They created something new. Around 1200 CE, everything changed again. A new culture swept across the Arctic, from Alaska to Greenland, in what might be the fastest human migration in Arctic history. The Thule people. And these are the direct ancestors of all modern Inuit populations, including those in Greenland. The Thule brought revolutionary technology with them. Larger boats called umiaks that could carry entire families and their possessions. Sophisticated harpoon technology with toggle heads that wouldn't pull out of large prey. Dog sleds for winter transportation. More efficient housing designs. They were essentially the Arctic's technological upgrade, and they spread fast. Within perhaps a single century, the Thule had established themselves from Alaska to Greenland. That's thousands of miles of coastal Arctic territory colonized in a few generations. It's actually remarkable when you think about it. These were people who knew how to survive and thrive in conditions that would kill most humans in hours. Now, the traditional archaeological narrative says the Thule simply replaced the Dorset. Better technology wins, the Dorset couldn't compete, and they died out. End of story. But when you look at the DNA, it's more complicated than that, because modern Greenlandic Inuit, who are descended from the Thule, carry Dorset DNA. Not a lot, but some, which means the Dorset didn't just vanish when the Thule arrived. Some merged with the Thule. Some had children together. Some Dorset individuals or families joined Thule communities, and their genetic legacy survived by adapting to the new arrivals' ways. Does this sound familiar? Because 200 years later, the exact same thing would happen when the Norse arrived. The pattern repeats. New people arrive in Greenland. Instead of complete replacement, there's mixing. Some conflict, yes, Some displacement, absolutely, but also some merging. Some children born from parents of different origins. Some genetic legacies surviving by joining with whoever's arriving next. And here's the crucial detail about the Thule that arrived in Greenland around 1200 CE. They weren't just carrying their own genetic heritage. They were carrying the accumulated genetic legacy of all those previous contacts and migrations. The Inca markers, the Aztec markers, the Na-Dene markers, the Dorset traces, all of it was there in the Thule gene pool by the time they reached Greenland. They were already a genetically complex population before they ever met the Norse. So by 1200 CE, the indigenous people of Greenland, the Thule, who we can now start calling Inuit because that's their own name for themselves, they represented the genetic heritage of at least 5 distinct populations. Ancient Siberian ancestors who crossed the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years earlier, Dorset people they'd mixed with, Inca-related populations who'd somehow made it to the Arctic, Aztec-related populations who'd done the same, and Na-Dene peoples from the Pacific Northwest. All of that ancestry was already woven into the genetic fabric of Greenlandic Inuit before a single Viking ever saw Greenland's coast. They weren't primitive or simple people. They were the genetic heirs of sophisticated maritime cultures spanning 2 continents. They knew how to navigate by stars and currents. They knew how to build boats that could survive Arctic conditions. They knew how to hunt everything from seals to whales. They knew how to preserve food for long winters. They knew how to survive in an environment that would kill unprepared visitors in hours. They knew because they carried the accumulated knowledge and genetic adaptations of thousands of years of Arctic survival. And this context, this understanding of who the Greenlandic Inuit actually were, genetically and culturally, this makes what happened next even more significant. In the summer of 985 CE, a Viking named Eric the Red arrived in Greenland. The Icelandic sagas tell us he'd been exiled from Iceland for killing a man. Actually, several men. Eric had a temper. So he sailed west, found a massive island, and named it Greenland, because, as he supposedly said, people would be more willing to go there if it had an attractive name. Classic Viking marketing. But Eric wasn't arriving on empty land. The Thule Inuit were already there. They'd been there for over 200 years by this point. They had established communities, established hunting territories, established trade networks among themselves. And they had a word for these strange newcomers with the prominent eyebrows and the red and blonde beards. They called them Kavdlunate, the eyebrow people. The Vikings called the Inuit Skraelings, and if you read the Icelandic sagas, that word drips with fear and suspicion. The sagas frame every Skraeling encounter as tense, often hostile. They describe the Skraelings as dangerous, unpredictable, alien. But here's what the sagas barely mention, what they gloss over in a few terse lines. For 350 years, these 2 peoples lived as neighbours. They traded. They learned each other's languages. They had children together. We know this because in the 18th century, a Greenlandic artist and historian named Aron from Kangek began writing down and illustrating the oral histories his people had preserved for centuries. His watercolours and manuscripts are some of the only records we have of what the Inuit actually experienced and remembered about the Norse period. And Aron describes something the sagas barely acknowledge. He writes that the Norsemen learned to speak the Inuit tongue, and the Inuit learned Norse words. They traded iron tools for knowledge of hunting and ice survival. They hunted together in the long Arctic summers. Norsemen took Inuit wives, and Inuit women married Norsemen. And for many generations, they lived as neighbours. Aron calls it the time of peace. 350 years of peace. Let that sink in. 350 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. These weren't Vikings raiding and leaving. These were farmers and hunters who settled down and realised they needed each other to survive in one of Earth's harshest climates. The Norse brought iron technology, grain crops, livestock and shipbuilding knowledge. The Inuit brought Arctic survival skills, hunting expertise and knowledge of the land and ice. Together they created something new. And we know it wasn't just trade and neighbourly cooperation. The DNA proves they were having children together. The 2023 genetic studies show that some Norse Greenlanders carried 5 to 15% Inuit genetic markers, and modern Greenlandic Inuit carry Norse genetic markers in similar proportions. This wasn't occasional mixing. This was generations of families with mixed ancestry. This was cultural and genetic blending happening over centuries. But then, around the year 1300, everything started falling apart. The Earth grew cold. Modern ice core samples from the Greenland ice sheet show temperatures plummeting starting around 1300 CE. The Little Ice Age was beginning. For the Norse, who depended on farming barley and hay to feed their livestock, this was catastrophic. Crops failed, hay harvests withered, livestock starved. The productive farmland that Eric the Red had found in 985 was becoming marginal tundra by 1350. And then came another blow. In 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe. The plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. The survivors were focused on basic survival, not buying luxuries. And Greenland's entire economy with Europe was built on one luxury export, walrus ivory. The Norse hunted walrus for their tusks and shipped the ivory back to Norway, where it was carved into religious items, chess pieces, decorative objects for the wealthy. But when the Black Death hit, demand collapsed. And even before that, African elephant ivory was becoming available to European markets, offering a cheaper alternative. So the ivory trade that had sustained the Norse Greenland economy for 3 centuries essentially vanished in the span of a generation. And when there was no trade, the ships stopped coming from Norway. No ships meant no new tools, no new livestock, no contact with the outside world. The Greenlanders were alone, trapped on an island getting colder every year, with no trade lifeline, with dwindling food supplies, with growing desperation. And this is where Aaron of Kanjek's oral histories tell a story that the Norse records don't mention. A story about a woman named Navarana. According to the Inuit oral tradition that Aaron recorded, there was a woman who moved between both communities. She spoke both languages. She knew both ways of life. And she told the Norsemen that the Inuit were preparing to attack them. Then she went to the Inuit and told them the Norsemen were planning the same. The oral histories don't tell us why she did this. Maybe she wanted revenge for some personal grievance. Maybe someone was manipulating her. Maybe she genuinely believed conflict was inevitable and wanted to control when it happened. Or maybe the story of Navarana is a personification of how the alliance broke down. Not one woman's betrayal, but 100 small misunderstandings and tensions that accumulated until trust shattered. Whatever the truth, the oral histories are clear about what happened next. While Inuit hunters were away from their camps, tracking seals and hunting caribou out on the ice, Norse warriors attacked the settlements. They killed the old people who couldn't flee. They killed the women. They killed the children. When the hunters returned and found their families dead, the 350-year alliance died with them. The Icelandic sagas mention conflicts with Skraelings, but they frame them as defensive. The Skraelings attacked first, the sagas claim. We had to defend ourselves. But the Inuit oral histories tell a different story, and they're specific about the sequence. The Norse struck first, and then the Inuit hunted them. Not in pitched battles, not in formal combat, but the way they hunted polar bears, patient, relentless, knowing the land, knowing the ice, knowing the Norse couldn't survive the Arctic the way the Inuit could. In the summer of 1343, a Norwegian priest named Ivar Bardason was sent by the Catholic Church to check on the western settlement of Greenland. The church hadn't heard from them in years and was worried about their tithes. Ivar sailed to Vesterbygd, as the Norse called it, expecting to find a struggling but surviving community. Instead, he found something that haunted him enough to write it down in detail. His report from 1364 describes it. When they arrived at Vesterbygd, they found no people, neither Christian nor heathen, only empty farms and houses. They took some of the livestock they found wandering wild through the abandoned settlements. The houses were in good condition, the churches were intact, but no one was there to claim them. No one was there at all. Ivar searched everywhere, every farm, both churches, nothing. The entire western settlement, hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 or more, just gone. The Icelandic records say the last ship from Vesterbygd arrived in Iceland in 1341, just 2 years before Ivar got there. So where did they go? The oral histories suggest some were killed in the conflicts. Some probably fled south to the eastern settlement called Österbygd. Some might have tried to sail back to Iceland or Norway. We don't know. But Vesterbygd was finished. The eastern settlement lasted longer. The last documented ship from Greenland reached Iceland in 1410. That's almost 70 years after the western settlement was abandoned. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because the eastern settlement seems to have been different. The archaeological evidence shows the western settlement's end was relatively sudden, but in the eastern settlement, things were more gradual, more complicated. And here's where those two Norse boys come into the story. In the eastern settlement area, archaeologists found graves, Norse-style burials, Christian orientation, everything you'd expect. But when they extracted DNA from the bones of 2 young males found there, they got a surprise. These were Norse boys. Their DNA confirmed it. But when they traced the lineage forward, when they looked for descendants, they found them among modern Greenlandic Inuit. These boys' genetic line didn't end. They had children. Those children had children. And those descendants are alive today in Greenland. The boys were taken. Maybe captured in a raid, maybe traded, maybe they were orphans from a dying settlement and were adopted or enslaved. We don't know the circumstances, but Aaron's oral history collection includes accounts of this. After the fighting in the west, some Norse children were taken by Inuit in the south. 2 boys were raised as Inuit hunters. They learned to speak Inuit. They learned to hunt like Inuit. They married Inuit women. Their children grew up Inuit. Over generations, they forgot they had Norse blood, but 7 centuries later, the DNA reveals the truth. Their descendants carry both heritages, Norse and Inuit, blended completely. And this probably wasn't just 2 boys. The genetic evidence suggests more widespread mixing in the eastern settlement. Some Norse probably did adapt. They learned Inuit survival skills. They learned the language. They joined Inuit communities. They had children who were raised Inuit. Over a few generations, the Norse identity dissolved. The language was forgotten. The Christian religion was abandoned. But the genes remained. So what happened to the last Norse Greenlanders? Some died in conflicts. Some starved when the climate turned too cold for farming and the ships stopped bringing supplies. Some sailed away to Iceland or Norway, abandoning the settlements. And some transformed. They stopped being Norse and became Inuit. Not through conquest, not through forced assimilation, but through adaptation, through survival, through choice. So here we are in 2023. Geneticists are extracting DNA from modern Greenlandic Inuit volunteers. Just routine ancestry work, building databases, understanding population genetics, standard stuff. And then they sequence the genomes and start looking at the markers. And what they find is layers, like an archaeological excavation, but written in genetic code. The deepest layer, the oldest genetic signatures, come from ancient Siberian populations. These are the ancestors who crossed the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years ago. The Sakak and Dorset genetic contributions are there too, faint but present. Then come the Inca-related markers, dating to somewhere between 800 and 1000 CE, possibly earlier, the oldest Mesoamerican signature in the Greenlandic genetic record. Next layer, Aztec-related markers, dating to roughly 1300 to 1500 CE, corresponding with the period of Aztec cultural florescence in central Mexico. Then Na-Dene markers, overlapping somewhat, but continuing more recently. These are from Pacific Northwest coastal peoples, and the genetic dating suggests contact over several centuries. Then we have the Thule markers. This is the base population of modern Inuit, the main genetic heritage. And finally, the most recent layer, before modern times, Norse markers, 5 to 15% in some individuals. Evidence of those 350 years of alliance, of intermarriage, of the children born from Norse and Inuit parents. And here's the detail that proves this isn't just general Indigenous American ancestry that all Inuit might share. Canadian Inuit don't have this pattern. They have the Thule base. They have traces of Dorset mixing. But they don't have the Inca markers. They don't have the Aztec markers. They don't have the significant Na-Dene component. And they don't have the Norse markers. Those genetic signatures are unique to Greenlandic Inuit. Alaskan Inuit have some Na-Dene markers, which makes sense given their proximity. But only certain southwestern Alaska populations show this, and they don't have the Inca or Aztec markers. And they don't have the Norse markers, again, only Greenland. So what does this tell us? It tells us that Greenland, this remote Arctic island, was specifically a destination, a terminus point for migrations coming from multiple directions. People from South America somehow made it to Greenland and left genetic traces. People from Mesoamerica did the same. People from the Pacific Northwest, people from Scandinavia, all coming to Greenland, all mixing with the people already there, all leaving permanent genetic legacies. How did people from the Andes end up in Greenland? We don't know the exact routes or mechanisms. Maybe coastal trading networks extended further than we've realised. Maybe there were deliberate expeditions. Maybe climate events forced migrations. Maybe there were cultural or religious reasons for these journeys. The how and why are still being researched, but the what is undeniable. The DNA is there. The markers don't lie. And the timing is significant. The Inca-related markers date to 800 to 1000 CE. That's 300 to 500 years before Columbus. That's even before the Inca Empire as we know it existed. The empire didn't form until the 1400s. So we're talking about Inca-related peoples, ancestors of what would become the Inca, making these journeys nearly 1,000 years ago. The Aztec markers are later, but still pre-Columbian. The Aztec Empire was at its height from roughly 1300 to 1521 CE, and the genetic markers correspond to that period. And the Na-Dene markers suggest ongoing contact between Arctic and Pacific Northwest populations over several centuries. All of this was happening through Indigenous navigation, Indigenous boat building, Indigenous knowledge of currents and stars and weather patterns, Indigenous survival skills that allowed people to cross thousands of miles of open ocean and survive in the Arctic when they got there. And for 200 years, Western academics insisted it was impossible. They dismissed oral histories about these journeys as myths. They said the boats weren't sophisticated enough. They said Indigenous peoples weren't capable of this kind of seafaring. They were wrong. The DNA proves they were wrong. So here's the question we have to ask. Why didn't we know this? Why isn't this taught in schools? Why do most people still think Indigenous Americans were isolated, immobile, incapable of long-distance ocean voyages until Europeans showed them how? Because colonialism required a specific narrative. It had to. The entire justification for European colonisation of the Americas rested on the idea that Indigenous peoples were primitive. They were isolated. They were stuck in one place, using stone tools, living simple lives, incapable of the kind of sophisticated technology and navigation that Europeans possessed. If Indigenous peoples were crossing oceans, establishing trade networks spanning continents, navigating by stars, building vessels capable of carrying tons of cargo across thousands of miles of open water, well, then they weren't primitive. They were just as capable as Europeans. And you can't justify colonising people as capable as yourself. You can't claim to be bringing civilization to people who were already doing what you're doing, just in different ways. So when Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas and chroniclers began recording what they found, they recorded stories. The Inca told them about ancestors who travelled far by sea. The Aztec codices contained references to long voyages. Various indigenous groups along the Pacific coast had oral traditions about ancestors who journeyed vast distances by boat. And the Spanish wrote it all down. And then they, or later European scholars reading their accounts, declared it all impossible. Myths, exaggerations, the kind of tall tales primitive peoples tell, not real history. And this dismissal continued for centuries. When archaeologists and anthropologists became professional fields in the 1800s and 1900s, they inherited this bias. Indigenous oral histories weren't considered reliable sources. They were interesting folklore, maybe, cultural artefacts to study, but not actual historical evidence, not like European written records, not like proper documentation. Meanwhile, Danish colonial control of Greenland began in 1721 and continued in various forms until Greenland achieved home rule in 1979. For over 250 years, Denmark controlled Greenland's resources, Greenland's economy, and importantly, Greenland's historical narrative. Danish scholars wrote the histories. Danish institutions controlled the archaeological sites. Danish perspectives dominated the interpretation of evidence. And Denmark needed specific stories to be true. They needed the Norse to have mysteriously disappeared because the climate was too harsh. Because if even the Vikings, those legendary Norse seafarers and survivors, couldn't handle Greenland, then Greenland clearly needed Danish colonial management. It was too harsh for independent survival. The Inuit there needed Danish civilization, Danish Christianity, Danish governance to survive. They also needed the Inuit to have always been isolated, simple hunter-gatherers. Because if the Inuit were actually the genetic heirs of multiple sophisticated maritime cultures, spanning multiple continents, if they'd been part of Trans-Oceanic trade networks for centuries, if they'd absorbed and adapted to everyone who arrived, from Inca-related peoples to Aztec-related peoples, to Na-Dene, to Norse, then they clearly didn't need Danish civilization. They'd been dealing with cultural contact and adaptation for 1,000 years. They were experts at it. So Greenlandic Inuit oral histories got the same treatment Indigenous oral histories got everywhere. Interesting folklore, colourful stories, not real history, not reliable enough to base academic conclusions on. Aaron of Kangek's 18th century collection of oral traditions and watercolour illustrations, valuable as cultural artefacts, sure, but not as historical evidence, not really. The Icelandic sagas got similar treatment actually. Danish scholars spent decades arguing the sagas were unreliable, too mythological, too much exaggeration, too much clan boasting, not trustworthy as historical sources. And this was convenient because the sagas were Norse sources, not Danish. They represented a competing narrative of Greenland that centred Iceland and Norway, not Denmark. So the sagas got downgraded to interesting literature rather than history. And all the while, the genetic evidence was accumulating. Scientists were extracting ancient DNA from archaeological sites. They were analysing modern Greenlandic Inuit genomes. They were identifying the markers. They were seeing the patterns. They were noting the Mesoamerican signatures, the Na-Dene connections, the Norse admixture. But it wasn't being publicised widely. It was in academic journals, yes. It was being discussed at conferences. But it wasn't making it into popular history. It wasn't being taught in schools. It wasn't changing the mainstream narrative. Because the implications were too uncomfortable. If Greenlandic Inuit carry Inca-related DNA from 800 to 1000 CE, that means Indigenous Americans were conducting Trans-Oceanic voyages 500 years before Columbus. That fundamentally changes the story of the age of exploration. It wasn't Europeans discovering a world unknown to everyone else. It was Europeans finally catching up to indigenous navigation that had been happening for centuries, maybe millennia. If indigenous peoples had the boats, the navigation skills, the maritime knowledge to cross oceans and establish themselves in remote locations like Greenland, then every assumption about indigenous primitiveness collapses. And with it collapses the justification for centuries of colonial policy. You can't claim you're civilizing people who were already accomplishing the same technological and navigational feats you take pride in. You can't claim you're bringing advanced knowledge to people who'd already developed sophisticated systems of their own.